Hi everyone, I'm Cassie. I'm a PhD student at Rothamsted Research in Hertfordshire, and today I'm going to talk to you about how insects smell. So instead of starting off by saying how, I'm going to start off with why, because I think it's important to have some context going through. So this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you're not familiar with this, it's basically just some goals that were set out by the UN to achieve by a certain date. And a lot of these things come into play when we're talking about insects. So things like zero hunger, good health and well-being, things to do with food security and the climate change and the environment, they're all linked to do with insects. So how are insects connected to this? Well, I kind of made this slide, and I'm sorry to some of the insects I've put on this because I don't mean that they're ugly. But we start off with the good insects. So there are insects that are pollinators that are important for our ecosystems that we like to see. There's elephant hawk moth, which is my favourite British moth, and the bumblebee, which is a pollinator and talked about a lot. We also have insects that are bad insects. To use the word, I don't know, not necessarily mean or anything, but we don't really like these insects. So there's like the aphids, which are pests on crop plants, and things like mosquitoes, which spread diseases and are a burden on human health. And I've kind of finally, just to finish the little phrase, said the ugly insects. So I've got some beetles here. There's beetles which are kind of neutral, and a lot of insects are kind of neutral in that they're important in some ways, but they're not really huge impacts on humans. And then you've got things like bark beetle, which is a pest, but it's a pest of forests. So it depends on how much you really care about forests, but I would say that's not super an impact on humans, but they're still important for the ecosystem. So insects are really important in loads of different ways. And we need to understand how they communicate and how we can control them, if it's attracting them to our plants, keeping them away from plants or humans, monitoring their levels. It's really important to understand how they communicate. So just to introduce a concept of chemical ecology. So this is understanding how things communicate in nature using chemistry. And this slide I made for some high schoolers, and it's basically just saying that plants and insects can communicate with each other, insects can communicate between themselves, and you can find hosts, for example, like a mosquito finding a human being host by their smell. So smell is really important for this communication. And actually this occurs by different chemicals. There are thousands and thousands of chemicals which are involved in these types of communications, and the shape, the ratio, and the concentration of these chemicals is all really important. So just with the aphid, which is what I work on as an example, the chemicals you see on the left-hand side, it has a response to, and the chemicals you see on the right-hand side, it has no response to. And as you can see, there isn't really that big a difference between them. So understanding how insects perceive these smells can be really important to understanding what's going on with them. So if we look at how smell works, this is just like an arbitrary slide I've put together just to talk about the concept. And smell begins with sensory perception. You then have a kind of neural transition between the perception and the brain. Then you have something going on in the brain, and finally you have an output. So if we think about humans, there we go. So if we think about this chemical here, and we think about what's happening in humans, we sense it in our nose. The way that we transmit that to our brain is understood, and there are receptors involved and neurons involved that were discovered by Linda Buck and Richard Axel, who won a Nobel Prize for this work. It's processed in our brain. We understand a lot about the brain, and we understand a lot about how this is processed. And the output is that we smell coconut. If we think about this in insects, however, they sense a chemical. We're not really 100% sure on how sensory perception happens. We know quite a lot about the transmission, but then we don't really know anything about the brain processing. We can understand the output because they're either attracted to or repelled by it, or they do nothing. So it's pretty easy to see if the insect walks towards something or doesn't do anything at all. So for insects, they don't have noses, they have antennae, and that's where most of their olfaction occurs. So this is a picture of the silk moth, which has lovely antennae. It's one of my favourite antennae, so that's why I chose this one. And what happens in the antenna is not super understood, but there is a general hypothesis. So we think that the smells enter into the antenna through like a pore, and inside the antenna there's this aqueous solution, which we call a sensillum lymph. We then know there's these proteins called odorant binding proteins that are involved in some way. And then there are receptors involved called odorant receptors, and they have a co-receptor called the odorant receptor co-receptor, quite creatively named. We know these proteins are all involved. We're not really sure what they do. From here we get a neuron response, and this goes towards the brain. So on the left-hand side there, the top one is BioRender's diagram of a Drosophila brain, and underneath it is my badly drawn diagram of an aphid brain. But what happens in the brain is that they all go to this place called the antennal lobe. And then you have further on processing in the mushroom body and lateral horn, which are just two other parts of an insect brain. And these parts of the brain can be different in size and, importance in different insects, depending on things like how good they are at learning to do olfaction. So what we don't understand is, first of all, these proteins called odorant binding proteins that I briefly mentioned. These are the main focus of my PhD. And so, as I mentioned, they're found in the antenna. They're found in a really high concentration, and they're really conserved across all different insects. So loads of insects have this type of protein, and it's really similar. But no one really knows exactly what they do. If you take them away, they often can't smell things, but there is so much different evidence and so many different theories on these proteins. So we're still trying to understand what they do. The second thing I mentioned was the receptors. Now, the receptors have been looked at in insects, but it's actually funny because they're really different to the ones we find in humans. So the ones we find in humans belong to a group of proteins that were really well understood, and we really know how these proteins work. The ones found in insects are actually unique and completely different to the ones found in humans, which is really surprising. We still don't really understand how they work. We don't understand what they do and how they're structured super well. And in fact, this picture here is of the only structure we have of any of these receptors, and it was only published 2 years ago. So it's a super new field. In addition to these things, we still don't really understand what's going on in the brain and how they're processing these thoughts. Thoughts is a bit of an arbitrary word, but how they're processing what to do when they smell something. Because insects respond to things like different ratios and different concentrations of chemicals in completely different ways. Like you can change the concentration of a chemical and it goes from being attractive to repellent. And we don't really understand quite how these things are being processed in the brain. And there are a few people doing some really, really fascinating work on this. And there's a group that's, mapped out the whole olfactory parts of the brain in an insect, which is really fascinating, but it's still not quite there. So there's still a lot to learn about smell in insects. And yeah, I guess that's everything I have to say on it. And it's that basically we don't know how insects smell. So just to acknowledge all the people who've been involved in my project before and say thank you for listening. And I guess, I don't know if we're doing questions, but I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for a fantastic talk, Cassie. That was really wonderful. A great insight to the smelly world of insects. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or just speak up on the microphone. I don't mind getting the ball rolling anyway. So obviously I'm a little bit biased to spiders, given that I work on them. And yeah. I would like to say as well that I'm offended that you called beetles ugly. They're
yeah, I mean, that's why I sort of preface. I don't really think that they're ugly. It's just sort of, you've got to fit there.
No, I get you. You. Don't worry, I'm not a big fan of moths, so we're at an impasse there. So Steph's just spoken up in the chat saying that she's sad about the beetle ugliness as well, but I'm sure we'll all get past it. So spiders, I know, have a slightly different sensory ability to insects. So my understanding is that they often sense olfaction through their pedipalps, through a more sort of touch sensing rather than the kind of sensation that you have in insects. Do you think that there's quite a lot of variation that you'd expect to see in the other aspects of olfaction in invertebrates more broadly?
Yeah, I don't really know much about spiders, and I think that in terms of anything that falls out of the standard category of like mammal or like Drosophila, it's really badly understood in this in this area. So I don't really know much about spiders, but I think the fact that it's so different in insects, when it seems like such a fundamental kind of sense and a fundamental thing, I would believe anything is happening in spiders as well. And it's also about what their lifestyles are like and how they use olfaction. I mean, I don't know much about how spiders actually, how obligatory olfaction is for them, but with insects, it's a main form of communication for most insects. There are some that use things like vision more, but you find that the parts of their brain that are involved in olfaction are kind of pretty depleted then. So I would be interested to, I don't really know that much about how much spiders use olfaction, but I would be interested to see. I'm not sure that even that much work's been done on it. Wouldn't like to say.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
I don't really know.
Amazing. Any other questions?
Yeah, so well, I work on OBPs at the moment, and a question that's often thrown around in this world is which one is more important and which one is more interesting out of the receptors and these OBPs. And having spent 4 years working on OBPs, I think it's the receptors. So I'm should be. I mean, it's unofficial, but I'm supposed to be going to do a postdoc looking at the structure of the receptors. So the thing that I said we don't know anything about and there's only one structure of is hopefully what I'm going to spend the next few years of my life looking at, if that's helpful. But in terms of what's useful with OBPs that I've done is we can actually use these proteins in like sensing technologies and in things like looking for new pest controls. So yeah. I'm just looking at the other question that's come through on the chat. Am I aware of any smells that are from Helen? She's my friend. Any smells that repel moths? I can get back to you on a specific chemical. Maybe there are definitely some, but we don't really control moths that much because they're not. Well, okay, there are some moths that are massive pests, but most of the ones we have in the UK are not really pests. So there isn't that much.
Amazing. There seems to be a bit of an anti-moth sentiment, and I hope I haven't triggered that.
Oh no, yeah.
They are great in their own special way.
Some are great.
Yeah, absolutely.